During the early 1900s, the dominant economy in CANAVESE was predominantly agricultural. The majority of the residents were peasants who subsisted on the land's produce. Men primarily worked in the fields to sustain their families, while women handled household tasks. Cooking, washing, sewing, and even caring for the few animals that were usually available. Even the processing of hemp yarn, an activity very practiced in CANAVESE, was entrusted to women. The children, from a young age, contributed with their arms to domestic chores and to work in the countryside and in the woods, if we exclude a small part of the family belonging to the most affluent social classes. Misery. It was an everyday challenge that everyone faced, particularly when it came to ensuring there was food on the table. Among the jobs and professions that were practiced in the past, little remains today. Most trades have gone extinct with the passing of years and the improvement of technology. Many of these professions were linked to the farming and handicraft world, and for decades and perhaps centuries had remained unchanged. The association La Cagranda of Strambino. With a precious work of research and collection of tools of the time, she managed over the years to organize some street demonstrations where these crafts were shown and explained to the public. The migration of Piedmontese people to France and America has played a major role in the social and economic history of Piedmont. Since the 1800s, numerous Piedmontese have departed from their home region seeking job prospects and a better quality of life. The motivations for these migrations were frequently tied to the challenging economic conditions of the area, the quest for employment, and the aspiration to enhance their living standards. Emigration to France was one of the first destinations for Piedmontese. Emigration to the Americas, and in particular the United States, Canada, and Argentina, was a more marked phenomenon. Beginning in the late 19th century and into the early decades of the 19th century, the United States was the most sought-after destination for many Piedmontese seeking work in manufacturing and mining. Let's hear some testimonies collected in CANAVESE.
Qui quando ero in America, era in me bordi, due bordi, e una moglie. Siamo tutti in America, tre. E mia nonna veniva con 100 anni, e allora la famiglia io ancora sto mia mamma, e c'è morto tutti. Guarda lì, all'estate, mi era, e voglio dire, l'anno che lei ricordo neanche.
Mi sono sposata, sono andata in America. Sono arrivata in America, a dire la verità non è stato tanto facile, è stato un po' duro perché la lingua la parlavo neanche, ma comunque tutto è andato abbastanza bene, non posso lamentarmi. Mi ha dispiaciuto tanto lasciare me, mia famiglia e tutti i miei amici, che mi ora mi hanno sempre voluto bene. Vengo un po' commossa adesso.
Mi sudor, ma sono in Argentina e sono stata là fino a 3 anni. E mi poi ma mi ricordo più proprio quando era là.
E so che mia zia, sarebbe stata mia moglie via, aveva lo store a Buenos Aires. E è stata lì, è morta lì da collera.
Quando sono partita da Genova, nella nave era stato molto triste per me. Comunque ho trovato tanti giovani più o meno della mia età e quando sono arrivata a New York, sono discesa a New York, da New York ho dovuto andare fino a Chicago e da Chicago ho preso il treno sono arrivata a Los Angeles, dove c'era mio marito e tanti amici che mi attendevano.
Come poi diceva, la mamma piove portava un brosso al negozio a fare spesa, ma parlava di argentino, perché la della era buona. E poi quando la mia 3 anni sono qua, sono sì, torna qua. A man bazzò e la via 3 anni in Argentina per me, a dire che sono tu vai. Non avevo mai visto una mata da sola a bazzò, sì.
Per quando era le figlie andavano a lavorare in Francia, sì, era niente. E allora sono fatta smorose, poi sono sposata e poi sono partita, sono in America per venire qualcosa. E sono pieni tutti morti. Fino a l'avevo 2 mesi nati, tutti morti da collera.
For a young Canavese of the early 900, emigration is a painful but often inevitable solution. Otherwise, it is very likely that nothing will push him to admire views other than those well known to his family for generations. If the search for a gainful job does not force him to board an ocean liner, we can reasonably assume that for him, the sea remains something fabulous, drawn from other people's stories. Then, in the spring of 1915, the king and some ministers decided that the war that had been raging in Europe since the previous summer offered especially to us Italians indispensable opportunities, so even the best Canavese youth were asked to go and fight 500 kilometers further east, with reasons difficult to dispute. A triumphal ride is envisaged to be concluded by Christmas, and no one can imagine that more than 40 months of trenches will be needed in a context not too different from that of the other fronts, which, like painful scars, mark the body of a continent that is unknowingly committing suicide. For 5 years, the Great War throws the most civilized part of the world into total conflict, in which nations and peoples do not only fight on various fronts, the factories converted to war production are equally important, and as the months pass, we realize everywhere how essential it is to feed popular consensus, thus entrusting propaganda with a strategic role. Because this is the first mass war of the century, it gradually requires more than 50 million men aged 18 to 40 to be massed in the trenches of half the world. But quantity does not determine the outcome, and the clash soon turns into a stubborn struggle of attrition. In which one gradually realizes that victory will reward those who have managed to persevere longer, the will to obtain it, managing at the same time to weaken the overall capacity of resistance of the opponent. The belligerent states, therefore, need the consent and active support of the populations who, with their work and financial contribution, end up bearing the costs of the conflict. At the same time facing the most terrifying phenomenon of that contingency, collective mourning. Not easy estimates put the number of soldiers killed fighting at around 10 million. To these must be added no less than 20 million civilians prostrated by deprivation and disease. And finally, from that deadly flu epidemic known as the Spanish flu that raged greatly in various parts of the world in the final years of the conflict. In this dramatic context in which there is no family that can say that it has not been touched by a bereavement, the consent of the populations is obtained by the nation in struggle through different forms of assistance to the families of the recalled and refugees. Accompanied by a massive intervention of war propaganda, the repercussions of the national sentiments and sense of state of the various peoples in conflict are experienced for the first time on this terrain. Education in patriotism ends up being extended to all social levels through capillary forms of propaganda, schools, institutions, newspapers. Illustrated newspapers disseminate the reasons and necessities of the conflict for the benefit of the middle and popular classes. In the same way, posters and postcards also make known to those who cannot read the faces of rulers and military leaders, as well as the main places of conflict, often distant and unknown to the families of the combatants. In the image of propaganda, war is always just and victorious, and the enemy invariably portrayed as treacherous, if not blatantly subhuman. How much is it worth to others? From the spring of 1915, it also concerns Italy. The whole country has to adapt to a new reality that no one fully understands in its complexity. Even the CANAVESE laboriously bend to the necessities of the war effort. Millions of letters, although heavily censored by the military authorities, allow soldiers to maintain contact with their places of origin. Not infrequently in the village, it is the parish priest to write it, and in the trenches the lieutenant to read it to the illiterate recipient, like the mother far away at the front. There are no conditions for the uniform to allow the young man who grew up in the presence of our mountains to continue to be an educated individual. Respect for shared values. If it must not have been easy to convince some of the need to kill, it was probably more difficult to persuade everyone of the inexorable contingency that obliges them to ignore their own lives, to live knowing that they are exposed to a constant and unpredictable threat. From 1915 to 1918, more than 5 million Italians wore gray-green, and more than 2/3 of them fight in the trenches. This experience, we know from the numerous testimonies that still emerge from the family archives, indelibly marks several generations in arms. The trench is above all fear and horror, fear of losing your life, of suffering a mutilation, of being forced to attack in absurd conditions, horror for the destruction of bodies, for the violence that is exercised there. Due to the terrible hygienic conditions in which they had to survive, about 500,000 Italian soldiers lost their lives on the battlefield or in hospitals in the rear. Another 100,000 died of hunger and starvation in the prison camps of Austria and Germany in the post-war period. There are 220,000 severely disabled people with a proven significant physical and mental impairment that entitles them to the state pension. But many combatants and civilians suffer for years the after effects of diseases, infections, or wounds contracted in war. If one often gets the impression that the state considers soldiers who have fallen into the hands of the enemy as deserters, it is evident that those who have died fighting must be equated with a martyr. Even today, more than a century after the conclusion of a story that marked every family in a more or less tragic way. There is no place in our land that has not preserved and worthily honored the memory of that great collective sacrifice, ideally next to the war memorial to which we still go over a century later. On the anniversary of the victory stands the medal box, jealously guarded by every municipality of CANAVESE. There is a story that only the CANAVESE can boast, and if you start telling it, even in hints, you don't know whether to let pride or regret prevail. Because that of Olivetti, we have to admit, is not a story with a happy ending. it is difficult to deny that we have not been able to defend, as perhaps we should have, a heritage of excellence of various kinds, from purely industrial to socio-cultural. A heritage that made the city of Dora known all over the world, thanks to the group of men led first by Camillo and then by Adriano, the two architects of a story that remains extraordinary, even if bitterly ended. Camillo Olivetti was born in Ivrea in August 1868, inheriting from his father, whom he also had no way of knowing, the love for progress and the entrepreneurial spirit. Turin student of Galileo Ferrari's, he graduated 23 years old in industrial engineering. The years immediately following are marked by a long stay in London, which also sees him in the guise of mechanic, and by the shorter but probably more intense experience on American soil. The transoceanic journey, however, allows him to fully understand the reasons for the superiority of the American productive reality over the more traditional English industry, an experience that makes Camillo Olivetti the only Italian of the time to boast. A similar awareness: the United States will always represent for ours the frontier of economic modernity, without this admiration for the heart of the capitalist economy being able to affect his political convictions that make him, at the end of the 19th century, the most important exponent of CANAVESE socialism. Camillo plants in the famous Fabbrica dei Mattoni Rossi, the first Italian typewriter factory. The original model, the Olivetti M1 of 1908, was entirely designed by him, and only on the occasion of the celebrations for the 50th anniversary of the unification of Italy, Camillo took the opportunity to present at the Universal Exhibition in Turin a working section of the Officina Epo Radies. It is the fruit of that activity. That is, the M1. The First World War represents a decisive turning point for the industry of Ivrea, now well integrated in the territory that Camillo Olivetti deeply wants to respect, allowing the majority of his workforce not to irreparably cut off relations with the communities of origin, which must be able to maintain solid traditional agro-pastoral roots. Adriano joined the company in 1925. That is, a full year preceding the establishment of the Olivetti foundries and mechanical workshop, which were deemed essential for creating their own machine tools. Camillo cautiously sets up an apprenticeship for his son that mirrored his own experiences in some ways. The transition of responsibilities unfolds gradually. In 1933, Adriano is named CEO, providing substantial assistance to Camillo in leading the company over the subsequent 5 years. In 1938, at the age of 70, the founder left the presidency of the company, retaining only the management of the machine tool factory for himself. He died 5 years later in the hospital of Biella, a few months after that September 8, 1943, that had forced him to abandon his house in Ivrea and take refuge beyond the greenhouse. These are reasons not too different from those that push Adriano to ask for asylum in Switzerland, where he can only wait for the defeat of the Nazi fascists, forced in spite of himself to attend the last phases of the conflict without being able to personally influence. Adriano can try to give shape to his utopias. That's something Canavesano, in fact, seems to have it. Camillo's son postulates culturally homogeneous and economically autonomous territorial units, which he calls communities, and presents her with the survivors of a war terribly steeped in nationalism as a guarantee of future peace. In the community, the citizens will be able to create forms of participatory democracy. In the community, the affirmation of human rights will be harmonized with the indispensable industrial development. Adriano will also devote himself until his death in this direction, with results probably lower than expectations. Remarkably, the results achieved seem significantly better. Since he reclaimed control of the company, Olivetti ascended to become the premier enterprise globally in the office product sector. Concurrently, Ivrea experienced an influx of countless intellectuals who were drawn to Adriano's visionary ideals. Often very different from each other, they end up all involved in the attempt to create an absolutely unprecedented creative synthesis between scientific technical culture and humanistic knowledge. In Adriano's horizons there is not only CANAVESE. In 1953, a factory of calculating machines was opened in Pozzuoli, and the productivity in this plant ended up exceeding that of colleagues in Perotti. In 1956, Adriano Olivetti became mayor of Ivrea. 2 years later, the popular support that surrounds him in our land opens the doors of the Italian parliament to him. On 27 February 1960, on a train that was supposed to take him to Lausanne, Adriano Olivetti was struck by a sudden cerebral hemorrhage that was fatal at the time of his death. Olivetti has a significant presence. In all major international markets, the company employs more than 35,000 people, half of whom work abroad. In hindsight, we can say that Adriano's death marks the end of the Ilea project, which could have guaranteed Italy a leading role in one of the most promising and futuristic sectors at the time, that of electronics. However, wanting to conclude on a less painful note, let's say that again for all the 60s and 70s. The residents of Epiradia relished the unique status of being born in the illustrious city of Camillus and Hadrian. If you prepare for war for many years, you inevitably end up creating it. If these experiences turn out positively, it becomes unavoidable to enjoy them. And to imagine that the path of warfare is the primary way to settle accounts favorably between nations. The Italian people, who largely accepted the notion that Mussolini was always right in 1940, appear ready to follow him into the most perilous adventure. 3 years are enough to understand that it was not the right choice, and hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers, prisoners of the Allies, seem irrefutable confirmation. If we then combine the fascist responsibility for having placed Italy at the service of the Nazis with the short-sighted management of the armistice of September 8th by the monarchy, we find ourselves at the root of the IMI problem. A dramatic specificity that only affects our country. More than 500,000 Italian soldiers, without the necessary orders at the particular moment of the cessation of hostilities against the Allies, fall into the hands of the Germans. There are dramatic episodes of resistance, and that of Kefalonia is perhaps the best known. But in most cases, the Wehrmacht takes advantage of the disintegration of the hierarchical structure of our army. And the Italian soldier finds himself, in spite of himself, to be unimi, that is, an Italian military internee from September 1943 until the end of the war, in the hands of the Germans in the case of refusal to enlist in the militias of the Italian Social Republic, a choice disdainfully rejected by the majority of these unfortunate compatriots. These are the testimonies released by some CANAVESE residents in 2005 and 2008 in the documentaries Faces of Memory and 900 of a Country.
Jugoslavia abbiamo presidiato quei paesi lì. Intanto siamo giunti al 43, settembre del 43, quando è stato l'armistizio. Se non che siamo rimasti intrappolati lì, non potevamo rientrare in Italia e siamo anche venuti alle armi contro i tedeschi. Poi non avevamo più né viveri né munizioni, più niente, tanti si sono resi e tanti si sono dati alla macchia su per le montagne. Anch'io, piuttosto di andare coi tedeschi, ho preso la strada dei boschi e mi sono aggregato alle truppe di Tito. Ho fatto ancora 15 mesi con le truppe di Tito.
Hanno più terdesat varunga io mando in Germania e nella porta dopo imparai sono tornati sono stato uscito, magari succedeva qualcosa.
Un nazifascista che si è prestato, perché non ero solo. Molti come me erano fuggiti con i partigiani.
Il gruppo che sono poi andati a finire in Germania erano un gruppo di giovani, tra cui anche un nostro fratello e amici qui, consegnati da uno che era del fascio, via, consegnati alle autorità e spediti in Germania.
Questo tizio si è offerto di fare da interlocutore con i nazifascisti, che se noi andavamo a presentarci ci facevano l'esonero per lavorare la terra senza avere più rischi di stare nascosti o meno. Bene. E allora io sono stato l'ultimo a uscire. Io non volevo, mia mamma insisteva. Ci sei solo più te, cosa fai? Gli altri sono tutti fuori. Sono uscito anch'io. Siamo andati a Caluso. Lì all'inizio del paese di Caluso c'era un albergo, lo chiamavano il Bogo, dove aveva il comando tedesco. Andati lì, allora lì l'altro ha ancora insistito. Non per me, per gli altri che erano stati coi partigiani, se vi presentate con le armi avrete un abbuono, no? Ci hanno di nuovo portati a Barone, col camioncino, anch'io. Sono sceso, venuto a casa. La mamma mi fa, ma cosa faccio? Ma mamma, fammi qualcosa da mangiare, tanto andiamo giù, ci fanno l'esonero, veniamo a casa, lavoriamo la terra e siamo finiti, ed è finita per voi e per noi altri.
Qui che era sì, terra sei un pià e un portale nuovo e un scaudà, poi andare in Germania.
E siamo andati a Torino, agli alti comandi delle SS, all'albergo nazionale.
E sono andati a finire in Germania, anzi, sono andati a finire alle 9.
Ci hanno messo tutti in fila lì nel corridoio, loro sono entrati dentro e dopo un po' esce un bestione di un tedesco, altro 2,5 metri, col frustino dietro la schiena e passa davanti uno per uno e ci fa: tutti banditi, carceri. E lì abbiamo aperto gli occhi, ma era troppo tardi.
Perché erano banditi. Alle 9 lo fai adesso o 2 di. Ma dopo 2 di, ancora io si cambio. E mi toccavamo su verso Borsa Paolo. E mi dice a me, e non me le case smetti. E sei già me che finché fuma.
Durante il viaggio il treno si fermava. Avevamo potuto saltare giù, scappare, ma è circolata la voce che se uno scappava, 10 erano, come dire, ecco, non si è fatto. E siamo andati in Germania tutti.
Raccontavano quel che avevano visto lì nei campi di concentramento, la fame che avevano patito, erano testimoni viventi delle crudeltà della guerra. E noi qui, ricordiamo, c'era la tessera dappertutto, la tessera del pane, la tessera del caffè, quando tutte queste fumne si industriavano in qualche modo a fare del caffè. Ti già provato a fare il caffè con su sì, con su là, col grano brustolito, con le grane d'uva, le vinasse, no? Ha detto, pia le grane d'uva, hai sorto un caffè con dei pepe.
Pian sciacco, terlisco, un po' di strada andremo, per poi siamo partiti. Siamo partiti a piedi, sì, siamo andati sui fino a Frasinai. Frasinai dopo abbiamo briolato 2 o 3 giorni per lì e siccome là era l'accampamento di partigiani, e nel periodo che facevano restare la maglia sono scappati tutti a Rum. E noi ci arrivavamo lì a Pignon, arrivavamo sulla Brigata Nera e la San Marco, un piano a portare a punto, la mattina via in Figiglione, una betta contro il muro, una toccare mandretta, col muro un chelo, per piantare una raffica di mitra, sai là dalla cera, un più finché fino a lascia tirare dopo. Poi da lì una porta a Curniato, un autointerrogatore, e poi una flappare, curare e frustare. Poi sono stato ancora una quindicina di dritto, e poi hanno mandato in ring alle 9. Dalle 9, dopo 7 giorni che ero un lampersone, hanno fatto una spedizione, hanno messo il carbestiamo, hanno messo insieme, sono andato a finire a Bolzano.
Il mangiare corrispondeva un pezzo di pane, un filone di pane tagliato in 4, in principio, verso la fine tagliato in 6, toccava una fettina così. Allora, una fettina di pane, una scodella di minestra e un pezzetto di salame o un pezzetto di margherina. Quello lì era il pranzo completo.
Bolzano era un campo di smistamento, lì era i politici da una parte, gli ebrei dall'altra, era una griglia tra me.
Sul treno da Torino a Portanova venne portato a Cala Tur, in Turingia, che sarebbe stato adesso la Germania dell'Est.
Quando ero a Bolzano, il campo di smistamento, era la cuoca che mangiava per una gavetta. E era un filbacione, è passato davanti a me e poi per 33 si è ficcato una cuoca. Quando arrivavamo a lì, era una sentinella che guardava, la brancola tira fuori dalla fila e pianta il mio tanta pancia da porta a porta. E prima mangiavo col di là. Mi vivo e piace, va.
Il lavoro in galleria, che come ho detto prima, si faceva nelle gallerie per fabbricare apparecchi a reazione già allora. E era la Reimag, che vuol dire Reich Maresciallo Hermann Göring. Era lui il ministro dell'aviazione. E difatti l'ho persino visto nelle gallerie.
E dopo avevamo il 25 aprile, arrivo sul mattino, pieni di guardie più. Non è questa storia, era ancora stato il campo e date pure a casa, la guerra è finita. Allora c'è un anno, pedalo a piedi.
Il lavoro in galleria è durato 10 mesi, però tutta la prigionia è durata 13 mesi, perché tutte le vicende di essere evacuati dalla zona sono andato a finire poi in un paese che si chiamava Thürendorf, quasi quasi ero a casa, no? Invece ero quasi in Cecoslovacchia. Abbiamo preso la strada a piedi, la famosa autostrada Berlino-Monaco, già doppia già allora, noi ce lo sognavamo neanche. Allora, e tuk, siamo arrivati fino a Monaco di Baviera, tutto a piedi. Avevo 2 piedi con delle vesiche sotto che non ci crederete mai voi altri. Prende un uovo sodo, taglialo in mezzo, poi mettilo sotto, puoi capire il male che può fare quello e camminare. Era una tortura.
Ero finito a casa di lei, e 2 campagnini sotto un fuoco, che te, e sui sudori, qua ero in Germania. Buoni su da lì, per carità, lì in tedesco, a fumarsi. E allora hanno mandato a stola, hanno fatto il caffè latte, dormito il paio. La mattina buonanotte, con il lavoro, sono rivalente il bogo, dopo ci passa la strada di chiusura, e lo trovo, torno del Tomé. Il primo che l'ho visto, io sono avvertito, stiamo a casa di giù, contro me, e guarda lì.
The clandestine anti-fascist movement first, the resistance and liberation then, took on the task of demonstrating, at the price of very hard sacrifices, that the ability of a people to fight and think and work can be repressed, but not definitively erased. One of the most important reasons that allowed fascism to assert itself and consolidate itself was the consensus that the regime managed to secure among the Italian popular masses. After seizing power by violence, skillfully exploiting the divisions and contrasts in which the other political forces were struggling, fascism founded its fortunes, on the one hand the police repression of opponents, and on the other the building of a broad consensus among all social classes. The beginning of the end of the fascist regime took shape precisely at the moment when the mass bases began to fail. The crisis of fascism therefore manifested itself with the utmost acuteness in coincidence with the military defeats, but it does not end in it or in the arrest of the douche by the king. The decisive step towards the liberation of Italy from fascism begins with the struggle that the partisan movement unleashes against the Nazis. And by occupying northern Italy, they effectively reconstituted, at least formally, Mussolini's faltering power. Thus, in a painful but victorious way, the redemption of the Italian people matures, freeing themselves not only from the oppression of the invasion, but above all from the shame of a regime aligned with Nazism, also in the persecution of the Jews. The victory of the resistance was made possible by the convergence that took place between the anti-fascist political forces, which also had sometimes very different orientations. A decisive contribution to the defeat of fascism was provided by popular participation in the resistance. The most politically significant act that officially launched the Italian resistance was the establishment by the anti-fascist parties of the National Liberation Committee. The most important members of Italian anti-fascism, communists, socialists, shareholders, Christian Democrats, and liberals are represented in the committee. The War of National Liberation manifested itself in multiple forms, protagonists of the resistance. They were in fact primarily the partisan formations whose task was to lead the fight against the Nazis from a military point of view. Behind this ideal front line, a people made up of factory workers, a large number of intellectuals, women, and young people. The partisan movement, moreover, could never have prevailed over such a ruthless invader as the German one. Nor could it even have been born if it had not had the possibility of drawing men, food, and aid from large sections of the population of the plains and mountains. If it had not been sustained by the often silent and obscure solidarity of the common people, the struggle would have had no raison d'être. It is no coincidence that Nazi ferocity has so often chosen to rage against defenseless civilian populations to try to strike and weaken the partisan struggle. In this sense, we cannot forget the general strike of March 1944, which saw the compact participation of the workers of Turin, Milan, Bologna, Florence, and La Spezia in the space of a week. An abstention from work during which over 1 million workers folded their arms. It was the first and only major general strike in Europe under the Nazi occupation regime. In September 1943 in CANAVESE, before the German troops occupied the territory, we can record the escape from the Spineto camp of the English prisoners, and at the same time that of the Yugoslav Jews confined to Chiaverano, Quarnier, and also to Castellamonte. Most of them, helped by courageous Italians, managed to take refuge in Switzerland through the Alpine passes, while the peasants of the hills of the Sacred Valley hosted the English prisoners, some of whom joined the resistance. The Pianaudi area is the one chosen by the first groups of stray soldiers who independently mature the decision to fight against Germans and fascists at the end of the month on the initiative of engineer Gervis. The first CLN Canavesano is formed in Ivrea, while the first fallen of the local resistance is Dr. Arduino Bertoldi of Quarnier, shot while rescuing a wounded carabinier in the attack brought to Pinelli barracks by German ESS fascists at the beginning of October. The gang formed in Pianaudi falls apart without fighting due to a German attack this October. However, he saw the consolidation of other partisan groups whose leaders quickly achieved a certain notoriety. These are Mario Costa and Lieutenant Gino Viano in Feletto, Lieutenant Morettini in Filia di Castellamonte, Piero Falsetti and Aldo Lari in Castelnuovo Nigra. Finally, the group led in Alpette by Battista Goglio on November 7th in Forno Falls, fighting Carlo Monzani of the Montesoglio group. And 3 weeks later, the same fate befell 18-year-old Domenico Valero. In the fierce fighting of Forno on December 7th, 6 partisans die with weapons in hand. Another 17 are captured and shot in the town square. On 13th of December, a fascist garrison was installed in the Pinelli barracks in Quarnier. The Piedmontese exponent of the Action Party, Duccio Galimberti, convinces the groups of Gimi, Troglia, and Ginoviano. Everyone calls them Bellandi. To adhere to the formation of Giustizia e Libertà Grandi are the roundups of March 1944 in the western Canavese, culminating in the looting of Ribordone. The partisans, wounded in the clashes, are freed with a daring coup at the hospital in Quarnier. The month ends with a violent clash at Trausella, while the following April. It begins with the attack by the partisans of the Carabinieri barracks of Castellamonte. 3 days later, the fascists shot in Caluso, 15 partisans brought from Turin in the month. Again, the musketeers of the Alps settle in Castellamonte. 120 young people from Canavese, who refused to join the fascist conscription, were deported to Germany. The anniversary of May 1st is honored with a strike of the workers of the industries of Rivarolo, Cornier, Favria. Rivara Forno Canavese. 3 partisans are killed in Castellamonte in a clash with Nazi-fascist forces. The month of June is characterized by continuous assaults by partisan forces on the fascist and German garrisons, and the railway lines are often sabotaged at the end of the month at the Cornier toll. He falls fighting Italo Rossi, commander of the Matteotti formations. On July 7th, an encounter took place in Dosegna, where Piero Piero's partisans and the 10th MAS Marines, led by Commander Bardelli, who perished along with 11 comrades, clashed. 3 partisans also fell. Bellandi's partisans defended Pont Canavese's free zone against a German tank assault for a lengthy period. Cleric Aldo Peno was among the fallen, who will be awarded the Silver Medal in memory. In these clashes on the banks of the Orco, the losses between fascists and Germans were very heavy. On 28th of July, the partisan Ferruccio Nazionale was hanged in Ivrea. At the beginning of August, the Battle of Ceresole Reale rages, where 2 Garibaldi brigades and a Justice and Freedom detachment resist the German and fascist troops, also injuring Minister Pavolini and the commander of the 10th MAS, Valerio Borghese. On this occasion, the commander of the 49th Brigade, Battista Goglio, known as Titala, also for him a silver medal in memory. In retaliation for an ambush by the partisans, Filetto is set on fire, 4 civilians shot, and 262 houses damaged. In November, the tragedy of Galicia occurred. 24 former English prisoners, escorted by 14 partisans of justice and freedom, try to reach the Deseres Valley from Ceresole, but, surprised by a storm, lose their lives. In Ivrea, on Christmas Eve, the railway bridge over the Dora is blown up by Alimiro's men, a sabotage that spares the city and Olivetti an Allied bombing. On January 30th, Walter Filac was captured. Commander of the 76th Garibaldi Brigade, then shot in Cornier at the beginning of February. A similar fate befell numerous exponents of the various partisan formations of the Canavese. In addition to the fallen already named, we remember the 7 young people shot in Candia Canavese, and then again Pasquale Duke, shot in Valsoana El Eporidies, Gino Pistoni, fell in the Is Valley, Luigi Gialdrone, Commander Vigin. His brother Domenico died in an ambush at Barone Canavese, shot at the castle of Orio Canavese, and in the same municipality the shooting of Giuseppe Ponzetto, and again Giovanni Costanzo di Cascine, Romano Glistrambinesi, Guerrino Bazzucco, Pietro Valesano, and Giovanni Pignocco. On 13-14 October 1944, the Nazis shot 11 partisans and 2 civilians in the main square of Travisella in retaliation. Even today it is visible on the wall of a house the writing in German, "Attention, danger Gans." On April 13th, the military command of the CLN ordered all partisan formations to prepare for the final attack on the Nazi-fascist forces. And on 23rd of April, the garrisons of the Monte Rosa Alpine Division of Rivarolo and Castellamonte surrendered to the partisan forces. On 26 April, obeying the order of insurrection issued the day before by the Regional Military Command of the CLNI, Canavesani rebels descended towards Turin to liberate the city before the arrival of the Allied troops. Turin is free on the 27th. But for many places in Canavese, only in the month of May will it be possible to fully celebrate the end of the war and the return of freedom. In 1969, Amerigo Vigliermo, passionate about folk singing, took over the direction of the Baiolese choir, start immediately looking for new ways in the proposal of choral singing. Amerigo's intention was to create a new repertoire for the choir, to distinguish itself from other similar groups, but to outline a different world, made not only of songs but of life experiences and customs. That would change shortly thereafter, encourages Vigliermo to pursue in a systematic and widespread way the search for new testimonies to enrich the knowledge of what had been in the past, the reality of Canavese. Let's hear Amerigo in an interview given for the making of the film The Walnut Shell Season.
Il centro etnologico canavesano rappresenta la collaborazione culturale tra il coro baionese e gli enti territoriali del Canavese, come comuni, comunità montane. Il CEC è nato perché pensavamo che dovevamo partecipare tutti. Noi abbiamo fondato il CEC non prendendo dei partner come le banche o coloro che hanno dei soldi. Abbiamo cercato di chiamare a collaborare con noi i comuni, le comunità montane e tutti gli enti che sono stati votati dalla gente. Pian pianino ci siamo accorti che il più grande lavoro che noi abbiamo fatto è stato quello di aver fatto prendere coscienza culturale ai canavesani di ciò che sono e di ciò che sanno. Io sono nato in una famiglia dove il ramo femminile era un ramo canterino. Chi troneggiava in questo harem era la magnanetta. La sera, specialmente nel periodo invernale, la stalla della zia Annetta si popolava e ricamava le cifre sulle federe, sulle lenzuola, che era la trussa, cioè era la dote che ogni sposa allora soleva portare in occasione poi dello sposalizio. Aveva il salisendi della luce e lei aveva la testa al buio e il lavoro sotto la lampadina e ricamava sovente le cifre con il filo rosso. A me col fil rosso mi pinda via da dosso. Per me il filo rosso della zia Annetta è quello che ho avuto presente sempre negli anni successivi, quando ho potuto dedicarmi veramente alla ricerca. Ed è chiaro che la ricerca è cominciata proprio con i canti, con le litanie che lei cantava o diceva, con le preghiere che lei diceva e insegnava anche a noi. E così, andando avanti nel tempo, io mi sono accorto che attorno a me non c'era solo la zia Annetta, la nonna Caterina, ma tutte le persone con cui io avevo a che fare, secondo me, erano altrettanti testimoni di una cultura che pian pianino si trasformava, scappava. Dentro di me c'è sempre rimasto l'attaccamento a quell'altro mondo, a quello dei sentimenti, a quello degli affetti familiari. E ho sempre trovato che i miei vecchi non sono stati mai riconosciuti per quello che hanno fatto, non solo per loro, per la famiglia, ma per la comunità dove vivevano. Il nostro discorso, ed è il discorso che ho trasportato nel coro baiolese, nel centro etnologico, non è un discorso prettamente musicale o artistico, tutt'altro, è un discorso invece di riuscire a dare a loro e poi a tutti gli altri canavesani che ho conosciuto dopo, perché avevano la stessa caratteristica, un riconoscimento, un ricordo che le loro cose erano cose importanti, cose culturali da conservare, degne di qualificare un'epoca, degne di qualificare un momento di vita particolare. La nostra modalità di ricerca, che è tutt'altro che scientifica, è basata sui sentimenti, sull'amicizia, sulla disponibilità delle persone, ha fatto prendere pian pianino coscienza che le loro cose erano quelle che interessavano ed erano quelle che determinavano la loro radice culturale. In questo panorama dobbiamo inserire il lavoro di Costantino Nigra, che ci porta a considerare il canto narrativo. Il canto narrativo è il canto più importante, è il genere di canto più importante che abbiamo noi in canavese, perché il canto narrativo raccolto dal Nigra è un canto che incarna il mito, che va oltre il tempo. Non è una cronaca, ma se parla dell'amore, magnifica il sentimento d'amore come mito. L'amore preso in maniera tale che condiziona la vita. Oppure se parla dell'onestà, parla dell'onestà. Non solo, ma il canto che il Nigra ha raccolto nel suo volume, a mio parere, va ancora visto sotto un altro aspetto, non solo sotto l'aspetto musicale, ma sotto l'aspetto della pedagogia familiare. Il canto ti insegna come devi comportarti nella vita. E se vogliamo, il canto quasi quasi è anche un po' come una legge del contrappasso dantesco, perché se tu non osservi le cose che ti ha insegnato tua madre, tuo nonno, tuo zio, e non ti comporti così, la fine che farai è questa qui. Quindi vedete in quante cose il canto, questo ci ha aperto il cervello andando tra la gente, mica. C'è nessuno che parla dei canti narrativi del Nigra sotto l'aspetto pedagogico. Ed è una pedagogia familiare, perché tutti i canti che noi abbiamo ritrovati nel Nigra e ritrovati nella bocca delle persone, le persone ci hanno detto così il cantava mio nonno per musaneme che duian comportasse. Io vi devo dire che non bisognerebbe avere solo la memoria per il passato, bisognerebbe già avere la memoria per il futuro. Questo è importante. Quindi la memoria è fondamentale, è il tessuto su cui noi mettiamo la trama, mettiamo quel famoso filo rosso della zia Annetta perché rimanga a testimonianza di qualche cosa.
The hope is that this documentary can also contribute to leaving an enduring testimony of something immensely important about our territory, its rich traditions, and diverse culture. It would undoubtedly take countless hours, days, and perhaps even weeks to narrate the events, characters, and situations spanning the decades under consideration. However, it is crucial to appreciate that even the smallest fragment of shared history holds significant value. It represents a meaningful step towards a more profound understanding of humanity. We all bear the collective responsibility of being custodians and narrators of events which, whether positive or negative, have played a role in enriching our historical legacy. It is imperative to consistently strive to showcase and safeguard the testimonies of our past, ensuring that future generations can glean both inspiration and knowledge from what are essentially our foundational roots in CANAVESE.